There's a story in the book of Exodus, around chapters 19 and 20, when Israel has just come out of Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea in this incredible, miraculous event, God saving them out of slavery from Egypt. And they're at the foot of Sinai, at the foot of this big mountain. And it's this scene that's like something from a fantasy novel or like a great big epic movie. There's fire on the summit of the mountain. There's smoke like a furnace. The ground is trembling. There's this great sound that's not thunder, but it sounds like thunder. And in that moment, the people, instead of trusting that the same God that has saved them out of Egypt is going to take care of them, they panic. And in Exodus chapter 20, verse 19, instead of staying put and communing with the God that just saved them from Egypt, they tell Moses to go up in their place. And they said that we'll listen to Moses. And this is what it says in verse 19. All the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. And they said to Moses, "Speak thou with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak with us, lest we die." And Moses said to them, "Fear not, for God has come to prove you, and that his fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not." And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew nigh unto the thick darkness where God was. They're standing in the presence of God, right when God wants to speak to them, to give them something directly. And instead of staying right there, they run. Not because God's doing something wrong, but because of something in them that was not ready. This is kind of the whole story of the Old Testament. We see God moving toward his people and his people moving away. God moves toward, they move away, not because God is doing something wrong, but because his people over and over were not ready to receive him. Sinai is kind of this microcosm, this little picture of something that continues to happen throughout the Old Testament. You have the wilderness, they're not ready to go into the land. You have the begging for a king, they're not ready for God to be their king. You have the temple because they're not ready for God to dwell inside of them personally. And then, of course, you have the incarnation of Christ himself, accomplishing what the law was never able to accomplish for them. This same pattern repeats over and over. God accommodates, he stays patient, and then he keeps moving toward them. Now, fast forward to the New Testament. Christ has died and risen again. He spent 40 days with the disciples, teaching them more and more. And then we have this picture of Pentecost, 50 days after Passover. They're gathered together, waiting for something to happen, participating in a pilgrimage feast. Jerusalem is packed with Jews from all over the world. And then suddenly you have a rushing wind and you have fire. You have the same signs as the mountain, the Sinai experience. But this time, instead of sending a delegate, they stay put. Nobody runs away. The fire lands on the people instead of on a faraway mountain. Something changed between Sinai and that room in Acts chapter 2. And this is the story of this video. This is what I'm going to tell you about today. At Sinai, the people of God asked Moses to take their place, to go up instead of them. But the problem didn't stop there. That wasn't the only time this kind of thing happened. While Moses was still on the mountain receiving the covenant, the people were already at the bottom building a golden calf. It had only been 40 days and they couldn't hold the covenant. Moses comes back down the mountain and they're already gone. Then you have Kadesh Barnea. God tells them the land is ready, but the spies come back and the people flinch. They're standing at the edge of everything God promised them, but they can't step into it, so the entire generation has to die in the wilderness. Not as punishment in the vindictive sense, but because they simply weren't ready to receive what God was doing. And God was patient enough to wait for a generation that was. Then you've got the situation with the king. God was supposed to be their king, or at least that was the arrangement. But they look at the nations around them and they want what the nations have. They want a man on the throne, someone they can see and point to. And God tells Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. God speaking there. Direct divine rule was available, and they traded it for something much smaller. And then you have the temple. David wanted to build it, but Solomon built it. And for a season, it was what it was supposed to be, the place where heaven touched earth, where God's name dwelled among his people. But by the time of Jeremiah, the people had turned it into a talisman, chanting the temple of the Lord, like the building itself protected them regardless of what they were doing. They had the dwelling place of God, and they couldn't receive what it meant. And then the word became flesh and dwelt among them. The very presence of God walks the roads of Galilee and sits at their tables and teaches them in their synagogues. And John says plainly, he says, he came to his own, and his own received him not. The crowd on Palm Sunday wanted a war king on a horse, and he came on a donkey. And within a week, they hand him over to the Roman authorities. Every single time, God moves toward his people, and something in them isn't able to receive it. But then the cross happens, and whatever the cross resolves, and it resolves the thing that the law could never, that interior problem, that heart of stone. 50 days after that, you see the result. It's the same signs, the same fire, and this time, nobody flinches. They sit right there and they receive it. So, what is happening in Acts 2, and why does it happen on this particular day? Of course, I don't think that God does anything by accident. So, we're going to look at why this particular day is when this particular thing happened. It's the Feast of Weeks, what the Greek speaking world called Pentecost, 50 days after Passover, one of the three great pilgrimage feasts that brought Jewish people from every corner of the diaspora back to Jerusalem. That's why the crowd in Acts 2 is so diverse. That's why we've got Parthians and Medes and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, all standing there together. This isn't a random assortment of people. It's the Jewish world gathered in one place, the way it gathered every year, and God chose this day deliberately. By the first century, the Feast of Weeks had become the celebration of the giving of the Torah at Sinai. The book of Jubilees places the Sinai revelation on the Feast of First Fruits, and that connection had become firmly established in Second Temple Judaism. So when the disciples are gathered in Jerusalem on Shavuot and the Spirit falls, every Jewish person in that city knows what that feast is. They know what this day commemorates. God is making a very poignant point. And then the signs come: wind filling the house, tongues of fire sitting on each of them, the sound of it drawing the crowd. Jewish tradition held that the Torah was given at Sinai in fire and wind and voice. And the rabbis even preserved a tradition that the voice at Sinai divided into 70 languages so that every nation could hear it. Whether or not you take that tradition as historical or figurative, what it tells you is that the Jewish mind already had a category for God speaking at Sinai in a way that crossed every boundary, especially and specifically national boundaries. Acts chapter 2 is landing in that category on purpose. Look at what's different, though. At Sinai, the fire stays on the mountain. It can't touch the people. They've already made that clear. They've ran away. The wind at Sinai, the voice, the presence of God, all of it stays up there while the people stay down here at the foot. Moses goes back and forth between them. But in Acts chapter 2, the wind fills the house where they're sitting. The fire doesn't land on a faraway mountain. It lands on each one of them. Every single one of them is Mount Sinai, or you could say the mountain has come to them. What's fascinating is that this is exactly what the prophets said would happen. It's not an improvisation. It's not Luke writing some fairy tale into the story. Jeremiah saw it. He said, "I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts." Not on stone tablets, not in a book, not mediated through a priesthood or a Moses type figure, but inside the people themselves. Ezekiel saw it too. He said, "I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes." The new covenant wasn't going to work the way the old covenant did, because it wasn't going to depend on the same thing the old one depended on. The old covenant assumed a people who could keep it if they tried hard enough. The prophets looked at the history of Israel and concluded that was never going to work, and they said so plainly. What's needed isn't better effort, it's a different kind of person. Someone with the law written inside of them, someone indwelt by the Spirit of God Himself. That's what Pentecost is. It's not the beginning of a new religion. It's the delivery of a very old promise to a people who are finally ready to receive it. At Sinai, they asked for a delegate, and God gave them one because that's all they could handle at the time. At Pentecost, nobody asked for a delegate because nobody needs one. That fire that stayed on the mountain is now sitting on fishermen from Galilee, but it isn't consuming them. Something has changed at the level of the human condition, and Acts chapter 2 is where you see it in real time. Now, there's a third sign at Pentecost that we haven't talked about yet, and it's the one that gets the most attention. When the Spirit falls, the disciples begin speaking in languages they don't know, and the crowd that gathers hears them in their own native dialects. It's not translation. It's not someone translating Peter's sermon. It's not an interpreter standing between them. It's an actual native speech coming out of a Galilean mouth. And the crowd's reaction tells you everything. They say, "Aren't all of these who are speaking Galileans? How is it that each of us hears them in his own native language?" Here's something worth noticing about the nations listed in Acts chapter 2. When Luke lists out the people groups standing there, it's the Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia. That list maps almost exactly onto the table of nations in Genesis 10. Luke isn't listing these nations for no reason. He has a reason. He's giving you a theological signal. Every nation that has scattered at Babel is represented in that crowd, and they're all hearing the mighty works of God in their own tongue. That's a clear sign. Babel scattered the nations by confusing their languages. And here at Pentecost, the Spirit crosses every one of those boundaries in a single morning. Something that was broken at Babel is beginning to be put back together. What the tongues aren't is equally important. This isn't ecstatic speech. The crowd understands what they're hearing. They're not confused by the sound itself. They're confused by who is producing it. And Peter doesn't stand up and explain the tongues as evidence of Spirit baptism either. He explains them as the fulfillment of Joel chapter 2. The sign points outward, toward the nations, not inward toward the spiritual state of the individual. So Peter stands up and he preaches. And what he preaches is not what most people think of when they picture an evangelistic sermon. It's a legal argument. It's a covenantal case built from Israel's own scripture, and it moves in three distinct steps. So we're going to take a look through those steps now. The first move is to explain what the crowd is looking at. Some of them are mocking. They think the disciples are drunk, and Peter addresses that head on. These people aren't drunk. It's 9 a.m, he says. What we're seeing is what Joel said you'd see. And then he quotes Joel chapter 2. He says, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and daughters shall prophesy. The Spirit poured on all flesh, not just prophets, not just priests, not just kings, men and women, young and old, servants. The selective Spirit that had always been given to specific people for specific tasks is now available to everyone. That's the first move. It's the first mention. It's the first part of his sermon. This age of prophets we're pointing toward has arrived. The second movement in his sermon is to establish who made it happen. Peter takes them to Jesus, his life, his miracles, his death and resurrection, and he makes the case that none of it was accidental. This man was delivered up according to the plan and foreknowledge of God, Peter says, and God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death because it wasn't possible for him to be held by it. And then he goes to David. David wrote about one who would not see corruption. But David died, and his tomb is right here in this city. So David wasn't writing about himself. He was a prophet. He saw what was coming, and he wrote about the resurrection of Christ. Peter is rooting the resurrection not in the miracle itself that came out of nowhere, but in the Davidic covenant. This is what God promises David's line, and Jesus is the fulfillment of it. And then there's the third movement in this sermon. It's the conclusion, and it lands with a single word, therefore. He says, therefore, let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God had made that same Jesus, whom ye have crucified, both Lord and Christ. Everything before it, Joel and David, the resurrection, the ascension, was building to that word, therefore. Peter isn't asking them to consider a new religious option. He's telling them what has already happened and what it means. Jesus has been exalted to the right hand of God. He's received the promise of the Spirit from the Father, and he's poured it out. And then 3,000 people respond. That number isn't incidental either. Just like everything else in the story, it has a purpose. It has a connection. After the golden calf at Sinai, Moses comes down from the mountain and calls for whoever is on the Lord's side, and the Levites take up swords and go through the camp. And the text tells us that 3,000 men fell. They died on that day. 3,000 dead at Sinai because the people couldn't keep the covenant at the foot of the mountain. And now you have Pentecost. On the feast that commemorates that same mountain, 3,000 people are added to the community of Jesus in a single day. They're saved. The Spirit does in one morning what the law could never do across centuries. The people who couldn't hold covenant for 40 days are now carrying the presence of God inside of them. The Bible is more than one story from one perspective. So I don't want to oversimplify things when I say that one of those ways of understanding the Old Testament is that it's the story of God moving toward his people and his people not being ready to receive him. And what's remarkable isn't that they kept failing. We would expect that of any normal fallen person. It's that God kept moving toward them anyway. Every time they weren't ready, he accommodated them. He stayed patient. He took another step closer. Sinai, the wilderness, the king, the temple, and ultimately the incarnation. Each one a step closer than the last. Each one met with the same inability to receive him fully. But then the cross changed something. It resolved the interior problem that the Mosaic law at Sinai was never designed to fix. In 50 days after Passover, on that feast day, the fire came down again. The same signs, the same presence, the same holy God who made the ground tremble at Sinai. And this time his people didn't send a delegate. They stood there and they received it. There's fishermen and women, servants standing in the presence of God with fire on their heads and the law on their hearts. That's Pentecost. Not the launch of a new religion, not a spiritual experience to chase, but the end of a very long story of God waiting for his people to be ready. And the staggering thing is that the same Spirit that fell on them then is available to you today.